From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The Biden administration quietly lifts its restrictions on Ukraine's ability to hit targets inside Russia with American weapons, but only to a degree. What's the logic behind this change in policy with these limitations as Ukraine tries to stop Russia's offensive in the Kharkiv region? Plus, a U.S. senator becomes first major political figure to call for a major American rearmament as global threats proliferate. Will anybody listen? Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot, editorial page editor of the Wall Street Journal, here on our Potomac Watch podcast, and I'm here today with Kate Batchelder-Odell and Joe Sternberg. Joe is based in London. So we're going to turn away from domestic U.S. politics and the Trump guilty verdict for a respite today and talk about the world, which we always have with us and increasingly more than ever. Russia is continuing its brutal assault on Kharkiv and eastern Ukraine as the United States tries to speed up its delivery of weapons. Now that Congress has approved some $60 billion in new military aid. President Biden last week leaked, or the White House leaked to the press, that he is also going to allow Ukraine to use some of those American weapons to attack Russian targets inside Russia. The U.S. had, over the course of the war, precluded that opportunity from Ukraine. Ukraine could use its own weapons, but not America's more advanced weapons. But as always with the Joe Biden policy on Ukraine, there's a catch. It can't use the most effective U.S. weapons to strike Russia, in particular the long-range ATACMS missile system. Let's listen to John Kirby, White House defense spokesman, explain the change here.
As the war has changed in character over the last 2+ years, our support has evolved. In the beginning, they needed Stinger anti-air missiles and Javelin anti-tank missiles. Now they need much more air defense and long-range capabilities. And we continue to provide those capabilities, again, as the war has changed, as Putin has changed his operational strategy.
Well, Kate, what do you make of Kirby's explanation? Sounds like he's trying to sell this change of policy as sort of a natural evolution, but it doesn't quite capture what it has been up to over 2 years.
Well, yes. I mean, if I could translate, perhaps I think it's that, as the situation for the Ukrainians has deteriorated at times, the Biden administration has then been forced to do things that's previously resisted. And allowing some limited types of strike in Russian territory is an example of it. But if anything, I think the Kirby explanation really demonstrates just how far behind the power curve the Biden administration has been on anticipating what the Russians are going to do and helping the Ukrainians get in a better spot to deal with it. This change on striking into Russia is pretty limited, and it seems like the rules of engagement are pretty micromanaged into things like only counter rocket fire, only if the Russians appear to be attacking you pretty imminently. So it's really limited on what the Ukrainians can do. And they're not allowed, as you alluded to use very precise long-range missiles to strike deep into the Russian rear and complicate the Russian effort to just move troops and supplies all the way across the Ukraine's northern border. So it really is just telling Putin, okay, move your supplies a little bit further back and you'll be okay.
The strategic importance of this inability of Ukraine to strike Russia inside Russia is that it allows the Russians to maintain a sanctuary. There, they can mass their troops, they can mass their reinforcements. And thinking that they're relatively immune from attack, Ukraine has staged some drone and other attacks with its own weapons inside Russia, but not too much. So when you have a sanctuary militarily, as we know from history, think of the Taliban sanctuary in Pakistan, for example, during the long Afghan conflict. Think of the North Vietnamese sanctuaries in Cambodia and Laos during the Vietnam War. It is an enormous strategic advantage, Joe Sternberg, and it's a big problem, has been a big problem for Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, there's been this asymmetric quality to the way the U.S. has wanted to approach this, where we seem to be perfectly content for there to be warfare happening in Ukraine, because that's where we will allow Ukrainians to use the weapons that we've provided up until this very limited exemption that we're talking about today. We're perfectly happy for the Russians to fight in Ukraine, as evidenced by the fact that we've been dilly-dallying on arms aid to Ukraine over the past 2 years. But we seem to be very reluctant to allow the Ukrainians to use any tools that they can get their hands on to take some of the fight into Russia and impose that cost on Putin. And I think that that's very important, both in, from the perspective of the conduct of the war right now. But if you assume that we are headed toward some form of negotiated conclusion at some point, then I think that an important part of making sure that you end up with a negotiated outcome that is as good as possible for Ukraine under the circumstances, and also as good as possible for the rest of Europe under the circumstances, is to make sure that Putin's regime is experiencing some cost of this invasion. And I think that allowing a breach in this asymmetric principle that we've been operating under would be very helpful.
Ukraine desperately needs these U.S. weapons, which are being rushed to the countries in the wake of Congress's passing aid. Let's listen to John Kirby again, try to assign responsibility to the other guys for any delays.
The delay that most prolonged this war and made things difficult was the delay in the Congress, when we had a supplemental request submitted in October of last year. And for 6 months, Congress did nothing to get us the kinds of funding we needed to supply Ukraine. And for 6 months, basically, the Ukrainians got nothing from the United States, the biggest contributor of security assistance. In just the month or so since that supplemental was passed, I would remind you that we had submitted now 5 security assistance packages to Ukraine to get them the capabilities that they need.
Kate, Kirby does have a point here about the long delay in Congress, although he is absolving the administration of any responsibility for the fact that it has had this half-hearted strategy towards Ukraine of wanting Ukraine to have enough weapons that it doesn't lose, but not enough that it would actually force Vladimir Putin to think that the costs of the war are too high for him.
I think the delay in Congress was damaging. I don't dispute that. I think that it allowed the Russians to really question whether the U.S. was going to continue to support Ukraine, and it created a question of whether we would continue to arm them. So I do think that was damaging. But I mean, an example that I might use that I think kind of illustrates the half-heartedness the Biden administration has shown is F-16 fighter jets. Biden approved training Ukrainian pilots on F-16s in May of last year. There are no jets in Ukraine as of now. Hopefully very, very soon is what we keep hearing. But the Air Force is on track, they say, to train, I think, 12 pilots by the end of this fiscal year, which is just not enough if you're fighting against the Russian Air Force. So that's an example where the Biden administration has had a year to set up a novel training program and to try to get a plan to get aircraft into Ukraine. And they have been extremely slow. And so there are other examples too. I mean, we were even well before the delay in Congress. It was very clear that with a large number, a few dozen at least, of these long-range missiles known as ATACMS, Ukraine could make a real difference in hitting Crimea and holding it at risk, forcing Putin to defend it. Again, the Biden administration delayed those for 18 months. I mean, so these are long delays that really made a difference that can't be blamed on Congress.
All right, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll have more on the American aid and the state of the war in Ukraine, as well as we'll talk about a member of Congress who's actually speaking out about America's weakening defenses when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot here with our Potomac Watch podcast with Kate Odell and Joe Sternberg. And Joe, let's talk about the state of the Ukraine conflict right now. Russia has been focusing on Kharkiv. There's real concern that there's going to be a broader summer advance and offensive by the Russians. We don't know if that will happen. Perhaps it will be stymied with the Ukrainians getting more weapons. But Russia is also going to full mobilization, or close to it, ramping up its drafting of conscripts from Russia and also devoting more of its economy to wartime situation. Meanwhile, with Ukraine suffering losses in territory, in recent weeks. Poland has said it may send its own troops into Ukraine if it looked like Russia will win. And that, of course, would implicate NATO troops. Now, NATO would not be obliged under Article 5 of its NATO treaty to get involved unless a member of NATO is attacked itself. But that would really complicate things considerably, Joe.
Yes, and I mean, not to harp too much on a point that Kate made before the break, but this is all an excellent argument for not having allowed things to get to this point by having accelerated the aid to Ukraine much sooner in this war. I think that this news of the Russian mobilization is important because people have been making a bunch of potentially bad assumptions about the limits of Putin's ability and willingness to mobilize resources behind this war. And it turns out that he understands the stakes to be important enough for him that he is prepared to take some of the domestic risks associated with the kind of mobilization that they're talking about right now in order to continue making the sort of progress that he's been able to make in Ukraine to date. So I think we need to take that seriously. That's a signal that the guy on the other side of this conflict is very serious about winning it, and to pay attention to that. Because again, I think this Poland news and unease in other parts of Europe about the situation are a signal that our allies in Europe understand how important this conflict is and what the implications would be of having a much longer border between, territory that is some way in the Russian sphere and NATO, which is what we're going to end up with if we aren't careful here. And I think that creates a Europe that is a much more dangerous place than it was before February of 2022.
Joe, you say that Europe is recognizing just how important this is. Certainly that's true of some of the Europeans. I think it's been true from the start of the Brits, for example. It's been true of the border states like Finland and the Baltic states and Poland. Less so of Germany, which has still not really delivered on given to Ukraine, given the size of its economy and its financial capacity to do so. What concerns me is that even as somebody like Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, escalates his rhetoric about the threat from Russia, and I think not without reason, Europe is still not meeting the moment in terms of its investments and its aid to military aid, and quite apart from what it delivers to Ukraine, what it is willing to do and what it is willing to spend to buck up its own defenses.
The problem that Europe has is that I think that they understand now the pickle that they are in, but they are starting from such a low baseline that they have been startled at how difficult it is to flip that switch once you decide that you do want to take action. So the pattern across Europe is that countries have been increasing their defense spending pretty significantly. I think at the last count, something like 18 NATO members are now meeting the commitment to spend 2% of GDP on defense. It was only, 4 or 5, a decade ago. The Germans are pumping 100 billion euros into various forms of defense procurement over the next few years. So that's a sign of the recognition. The problem is that they have allowed their defense industrial base to hollow out over the past few decades since the end of the Cold War. And they are discovering that it isn't the sort of thing where if you don't have it, it's going to take a long time to build it. So I think that's really the situation that they find themselves in and why it is so difficult for them to rally to deliver the forms of aid to Ukraine where you would probably have domestic political support for a lot of this. It's just that they do not have the capacity to manufacture the munitions or the other arms that otherwise they would want, and it's going to take them a long time to redevelop that capability.